Good morning, everyone. Today is an episode which will be focusing on the teachings of Leo Tolstoy as a Christian, and this is entitled Deviation from Christ's Principles Began Especially with Paul. We're going to focus principally today on Leo Tolstoy's book Church and State from 1882. In this text, Church and State, Tolstoy critiques how religious institutions and governments join together to control people and support violence. It is very topical for today. Here's the context in which that quote was given. It is page 17 of the Church and State, Tolstoy, 1891. This deviation begins at the time of the apostles, especially with that lover of teaching, Paul, and the wider Christianity extends, the more it deviates and appropriates the methods of that very external worship and dogmatism, the denial of which was so positively expressed by Christ. We shall see that Tolstoy identifies here Paul as the one primarily responsible for authorizing deviation from the message of Jesus, who banned any hierarchy, archon, which is the Greek term, within the church in Matthew 20, verses 25 to 28, and Luke 22, 25 to 27, and likewise was condemning impliedly Paul's permitting rule by state authorities like Constantine over the church, who thus could inject a listed dogma about God into the church or else suffer exile to the barbarian lands where certain death would ensue. And we're going to see that's Romans 13, where Paul does that. Now, Tolstoy is going to write 8 major books on biblical issues, but 39 years before that, Leo Tolstoy studied Greek. So let's look at this. Leo Tolstoy began studying ancient Greek in December 1870. So the first work is in 1891 that's in this religious series. The 42-year-old author hired a seminary student from Moscow and with an intense passion for languages taught himself to read it fluently in just 3 months. He learned Greek to read the greatest works of antiquity in their original unedited forms. But his most famous application of his knowledge of Greek was his looking at the Gospels and then comparing and contrasting the verses. Now, here is a list of the books he wrote at the end of his life from 1891 to 1904. And you'll see the 8th title. There's some titles that are actually 2 and 1. For example, over here, My Confession and the Critique of Dogmatic Theology. But over here, 8, 4 Gospels translation harmonized. So he's going to look at the Gospels, try to find the harmony, and it's going to look like this. So he's going to have the Greek over here on the left. He's going to then do translations and make interpretations, you'll see, of what's going on. But that's the key. He's not someone who's ignorant of the underlying text. He can read it fluently, and he had trained himself by studying the classics. Now, many of you younger people would not know who Leo Tolstoy is in the first place. So let me give you a little background on that. He is a person who most experts say that he was the greatest writer in all of human history so far. Let me give you an example. So here are some of the top writers in history: Virginia Woolf, Ernest Hemingway, James Joyce, Vladimir Nabokov. So let's listen to what they say. The English author, Virginia Woolf, called Tolstoy the greatest of all novelists. Now, he wrote War and Peace, Anna Karenina. Those are the 2 I've read, actually, when I was a young whippersnapper trying to go on the bus every day to go to work in downtown Los Angeles when I started out as a new young lawyer. And that's why I fell in love with his writings. Ernest Hemingway, the American writer, boldly stated he wanted to, quote, beat Mr. Tolstoy, but admitted he couldn't. He ranked Tolstoy as the best writer. James Joyce, the Irish novelist, praised Tolstoy's 1886 short story, How Much Land Does a Man Need?, as the greatest story that the literature of the world knows. Finally, Vladimir Nabokov. He praised Tolstoy as the absolute best, noting his realistic style is unmatched. So let's look behind the statement of Tolstoy about the deviation begins with basically Paul, that lover of teaching, and the wider Christianity extends and deviates from what it should have been into dogmatism and so on. So Tolstoy is referring to Romans 13, 1-10. Submission to the rulers of this world as God's agents. So this is where the deviation occurs. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except by God's appointment, and the authorities that exist have been instituted by God. So the person who resists such authority resists the ordinances of God, and those who resist will incur judgment. Crema. So if you resist the ruling, governing authorities over you, and this is addressed to the people of Rome, these are citizens of Rome, that's why it's addressed to Romans. He's talking about, Emperor Nero and all the Senate and all that. All those people are what? They are God's appointed authorities. They've been instituted by God. So the person who resists such authority of Rome resists the ordinances of God, meaning the Roman law is from God. And those who resist will incur judgment. Crema. It is God's servant to administer punishment on the person who does wrong. But that's in their perception, by their law, not God's law. And if you read all of Romans, he says God's law is gone. You can do whatever you want now. You're free indeed, Romans 7. But here he's saying, no, you're not free of one kind of law, and that's the government of Rome's law. Therefore, it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of the wrath of the authorities, but also because of your conscience. So he's saying your conscience has to be felt guilty before God, because it's not from people or humans or regular humans. Nero is an irregular human. He's actually instituted by God, and everything he says is from God. Continuing, verse 6, for this reason you also pay taxes to Rome, for the authorities are God's servants devoted to governing. Yes, I'm sure they're devoted to governing. Now, Tolstoy contrasts what Paul says against what Jesus says. So the diversion away from Christ is in Romans 13. The message of Jesus is the kingdoms of this earth are from Satan, are under the power of Satan. John 18:36, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. He was asked about this from Pilate. Then if we look at this, I have Notebook LM. I put this book, Gospel in Brief, up there, and I asked it, what is Tolstoy saying about whether Jesus is in line with the idea that the state is controlling God's word, it's in charge of, when it speaks, it's speaking for God. So answered this way, Tolstoy argues that Jesus explicitly contravened the idea of state government ruling the church or the believer. When questioned by Pilate, Jesus makes his position on earthly kingdoms clear. I am indeed a king, but my kingdom is not of earth, but of heaven. See, so this is completely a 100% contradiction between Paul and Jesus. And this is the key point, that the whole point of church and state is the state is not speaking for God, but yet Paul says it is. Here's another example verse. John 14, verse 30. I will no longer talk much with you, for the ruler of this world is coming, and he has nothing in me. So the ruler of this world, Jesus is always referring to, is evil. It's from Satan, okay? Paul thinks, no, the ruler of this world is a good people, and they're from God, and they're ordained from God, and you must obey them. And if you don't obey what they tell you to do, you're judged by crema, and that means you've been damned by disobeying them. So you have to obey, not just from practicality or to not offend them, but you have to do it from conscience, because it's actually God telling you to do whatever these ruling authorities at Rome want you to do. One more. 1 John 5:19, we know that we are from God, and the whole world lies in the power of the good one that's serving us from Rome. No, from the evil one. And one last thing, is Jesus was in the beginning of his ministry, he had been tempted in the desert. And so we're going to learn who is the ruler of this earth, who is running the show when you look at world government. Satan offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the earth in Matthew 4, verses 8 to 10, and Luke 4, verses 5 to 8. In these verses, the devil shows Jesus all the nations of the world, claiming he can give the power to rule them to Jesus if Jesus will bow down and worship him. Now, Jesus doesn't say you don't have this power. He actually implicitly acknowledges it by his response. Jesus rejects this by quoting scripture stating that one must only worship and serve God. Jesus did not say Satan did not have the right over the earthly states. And he repeats again when he's in front of Pilate, I'm the king of heaven, not of earth. So we have an absolute contradiction between Jesus and Paul. And that's why Tolstoy is correct. Paul was leading us to a deviation, which is going to lead us, as he's going to explain, Tolstoy will explain, to be submissive when Constantine tells us what we have to believe and not believe about the nature of Jesus, God, and everything else. So that's where the topic changes on page 18. But Tolstoy says this, of church and state. But since Constantine and the Nicene Council, the church has been a thing of fraud. Next, Tolstoy is going to bring it home with this passage here on page 18. And I want you to think about what's going on in our world today, our political world today. I don't want to get into politics, but it's self-evident when you hear what he says here. The causes that led to it, the Constantinian takeover, were bad ones. By their fruits shall you know them. Matthew 7, verse 16 and Matthew 7:20. The source was evil, hate, human pride, hostility toward Arius. This is the opponent in 325 AD to the deification of Jesus at Nicaea, and others, and another still graver evil, the union of Christianity with power. So those Christians who are disabled by the false doctrine of Paul in Romans 13, totally at odds with Jesus, that the rulers of this earth, supposedly Paul says, are the agents of God, and if you disobey them, you're subject to krima. And Jesus is saying, no, 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 they're the agents of Satan, and Paul's got it wrong. But if we don't know this, if we lose touch with this fact, now you're going to have a union of Christianity with power, and that could even happen in our day. I want to make a note here. Constantine's penalties. So the issue of how Constantine was going to change us was all going to depend upon what? Persuasion, reading the Bible, studying it, giving us a verse or something we could read? No. Constantine used penalties on Christians with whom he disagreed with on the number of gods that exist. And he deemed them heretical, persons who insisted that the Father is the only true God, even though that Jesus explicitly says that in John 17, 1-3. Please go read that. It says, Jesus says, he prays to the Father, you're the only true God. Then these are the punishments. You were either exiled to the barbarian Goth territory in what is modern England, which is an effective death penalty because you're out in this barbarian region and these people are just murderous people. And so they are going to just kill and pillage and deprive you of all your wealth and everything you bring. So it's just like a death sentence. Or he would have all their books be burned, or he would give them both penalties. I just want to make this point too here is I want to show you this verse, John 17, 1-3, because when you research what are the records that are reliable from Nicaea, the answer is there are no records from Nicaea. Now, there are people who purport to have records, but there's nothing there. They're just empty shells of things that were created many time periods later. So this is what should have been discussed. And if you read the Nicene Creed, this is never discussed expressly, how they could reconcile what they're doing with making Jesus God, the Son. Not just the Son of God, a God the Son. John 17, 1-3. These words spake Jesus and lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour is come, glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you, as thou hast given him power over all flesh, that he should give eternal life to as many as you have given him. And this is life eternal, that they might know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom thou hast sent. The fact that says the only true God is the Father is unequivocal. And it's clear he's not including himself because he has to say, and Jesus Christ, which is an independent person from the one who's the only true God, which is the one before. So there is no such thing as Jesus Christ ever accepting the idea that he's God. He said it wasn't true. He said it right here. Okay, I want to show you something. This is 12 total quotes of John 17, 1-3, involving the very issue of whether Jesus said God was the only true, the Father God was the only true God. This is 12 quotes. I think it's the most on topic passage I've ever seen. I've used early Christian writings for a lot of things. I've never seen 12 verses that can all pinpoint one passage like this one. So let's take a look at this. John 17:3, Epistle of Ignatius 35-100, the Father is the only true God. John 17, 1-3, Irenaeus, only one God. The Lord had to know many fathers of God. He would not have taught his disciples to know only one God. So Jesus taught people to know only one God. Cyprian, it says here, and his life is eternal, that they might know thee, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you've sent. So this is clearly keeping that distinction. He's not the one he's talking about, who's the only true God. The Lord's Prayer, Cyprian, okay, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you sent. So it keeps going. And then goes on here to Cyprian again, Novation, Lactantius, Constitutions of the Apostles, known the one and only true God and Father, Constitutions of the Holy Apostles, so on and so forth. They might know you, the only true God. God, on the one hand, is very God, and so the Savior says in his prayer to the Father. So this is overwhelming evidence, yet this is not discussed anywhere in the Nicene Creed. You would think they would have to try to explain how this doesn't apply, right? But they don't. They have no way around it. And that's the problem. We have power telling us what we have to believe. And that was the whole thing. And it wasn't a spiritually advance for Christianity. Let's just put it that way. If you're going against what Jesus said about his own nature, you have done something wrong. And that's all I can say. And if you want to learn more about this, go to earlychristianwritings.com. And it's basically this website, and you will see all these passages. So when Tolstoy said earlier that the Nicene Conference was an act of fraud against the church, let me show you parallelism to what Jesus said in John 17:1-3, the Father is the only true God. Jesus specifically subordinated himself to the Father and explicitly identified the Father alone as God. Where can we see that? John 17:3, that they might know you, the only true God, addressing the Father. John 14:28, the Father is greater than I. How can that be if he's God? God, there's no inequality in God, right? So he couldn't be God. God can dwell in Jesus. Jesus says repeatedly, the Father dwells in me. Jesus says, the logos you hear is not mine, it belongs to the Father. That means he's speaking the words of God, but doesn't make him God. John 5:19, I can do nothing by myself. So he's powerless. What God is powerless? Mark 10, verse 18, and Luke 18, verse 19. Why call me good? No one is good but God alone. And it used to say God the Father alone. So that had to be taken out. That's 6 times. If you go to the early Christian writings, you'll find at least 3 of those. I found 3 more where it says, no one is good but God the Father alone. And in the Luke version, it says, no one but God the Father alone, the creator of heavens and earth. Okay, so you see, this is where this message of Tolstoy is to tell us this is only the result of the state getting involved, and it could commit fraud on all Christians and control the narrative because it has power over us. All right, so now picking up where we left off, this is pages 19-20. Tolstoy says, in reality, the acceptance of Christianity without the repudiation of power, meaning government power, is a mockery and perversion of Christianity. The consecration of governmental power by Christianity is even blasphemy, he says, is the doom of Christianity. That's what he's saying. Constantine destroyed us by ruining us from within and make us subservient to the state, which was Satan's kingdom. Remember, that's what Jesus says. Paul says it's from God's kingdom. You have to make a decision. But this is the view of Jesus, and that's what I'm going to stick with. And Tolstoy continues, having lived 1,500 years under the blasphemous union of pretended Christianity with government, it is necessary to make a great effort in order to forget those intricate sophistry, which for 15 centuries everywhere at power's pleasure have perverted the doctrine of Christ to make it compatible with government, and the attempts to explain the sacredness, the legitimacy of government, and the possibility of its being Christian. Page 20, Church and State. Tolstoy. At bottom, the words Christian government are like the words warm, hot ice. They don't mean the same thing. To understand this clearly, it is necessary to forget all those fantasies in which we are carefully educated and plainly inquire into the import of these sciences, historical and judicial, which we are taught. These sciences are without any foundation. All these sciences are nothing else than an apology for violence. And I think what he means by violence is that by allowing the state to become the director of what's doctrine that's true or false, the only way to enforce it is by violence. And that's exactly what they did. They murdered, killed, exiled, and stole and robbed people, disinherited people, all to enforce certain beliefs, particularly the Trinity doctrine, if you didn't know that. Continuing, page 21. Passing by the history of the Medes and Persians, let us take that government which first made a union with Christianity. There was a cutthroat's nest in Rome. One of the descendants of these cutthroats was Constantine. He ordered the introduction of this faith among those who were under his authority. And then in page 21, Tolstoy is going to make this sequence of statements that I all link together, and I want you to read the last line first. All this nobody told Constantine about. So now he's going to go through all the things that are inimical to Constantine's efforts, that if had anyone told him, he'd go, oh, I'm not allowed to do any of this stuff I'm doing. So now read it with that in context. The first line, kings, the archon, rule over their people. This shall not be among you. Matthew 20, verses 25-26. So by definition, Constantine being an emperor of Rome, how could he possibly be a ruler that would be justified? Jesus said, don't even have a ruler among yourselves. In the church structure, how could you have a ruler for the state ruling and governing and telling you what doctrines to believe, which is what he did at Nicaea, by the way. Then he goes on the next line. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. By the way, he killed his wife and daughter. We'll get into that in a minute. Abjure riches. He was living a lavish life. Matthew 19. Do not judge. Do not condemn. Wow, this guy was crossed those lines. Endure evil. He wouldn't tolerate evil that against himself. He would kill. Matthew 5:39-20. So then this is the humor of Tolstoy. All this nobody told Constantine about. So he entered the faith of Christianity, not knowing any of its principles. And so that's why he could do all these vicious, evil things. Let's take a look at a couple of things that most Christians are never told when they declare Constantine was one of the greatest Christians of all time. You're going to hear that if you go online. Was Constantine a great Christian? That they'll tell you he was a Christian. Constantine had his wife and son executed in 326. Okay, this was 1 year after Nicaea, when he supposedly was the guy telling us we got to have a deity of Jesus and all this kind of stuff. And if we didn't do it, we would be exiled. That's what he did. So only 5 out of 205 people approximately voted for the Trinity, the deity of Christ doctrine at Nicaea, and the other 5 were exiled. Some of those were pardoned later, by the way, by the influence of Eusebius, who was a secret person who didn't agree with the doctrine of the Trinity, apparently. Anyway, Constantine had his wife and son in 326 AD killed with no explanation given. No explanation was ever offered. Their memory was erased legally as far as possible, but it was unavailing. So I'll show you a little bit of the memory we have left of them. So this is a little article on Wikipedia. Constantine had his eldest son Crispus seized and put to death by cold poison at Pola in Croatia sometime between so and so 326. In July, he had his wife, Empress Fausta, stepmother of Crispus, killed in an overheated bath. Their names were wiped from the face of many inscriptions. References to their lives were eradicated from the literary record, and their memory was condemned. This was what they would do. They would kill the memory of people. They didn't have any way to justify what they did. So if you'd never heard of them again, you would never know he didn't have any justification. It's very clever, just destroy the memory of these people. I don't have to give any justification what I did. I just can be a murderer. I can murder anyone I want. I'm the emperor. Okay. Anyway, so that's the mention of that. So anyway, I want to show you one more thing here is the statement that Tolstoy referenced was the passage of Matthew 20, verse 25 to 26, kings, archon. So that's actually the word archon. He translated as kings, but that's fine. It's rulers. Archon technically means the word ruler. So let's look at Mouncy. But Jesus called them to him and said, you know that the archon of the nations lord it over them, rule over them, and their leaders exercise authority. So rulers, leaders, exercise authority over them. It will not be so among you. Jesus is talking about real legal rulers of nations. You should not have that kind of administration within the church. It's not that kind of organization, and you can't run it like that. So this is why inherently having the government invade into the church and tell us what to do was a perversion, just exactly what he said. But it wouldn't be a perversion if you believe in Romans 13, 1 to 10. No, that would be completely justified because they're just being given their rightful place. Their speakers, they speak for God. But I don't believe that. I hope you don't believe it either. I believe the guy who wrote this, the words are here on the page of Matthew 20. I'm talking about Jesus. Now, I want to read you a couple of segments out of pages 22 and 23 where Tolstoy is going to tell you that Constantine was treated with kid gloves, like he was allowed to just do anything he wanted, essentially. And that wasn't to his advantage, right? You should tell him what the actual message of the word of God says, right? Jesus' words. But they didn't apparently do that. They didn't have the bravery to do that. Well, the other thing that's not mentioned here is that he, for the first time, using the office of Pontifex Maximus, which means the high priest of all religions in Rome, he had a big budget at his disposal, and he put all the Christian bishops on salary. Now they went from being poor and needy and having to be helped by others. No, they didn't even ask for their congregation to give any support to their efforts, and they were getting money from the state. So that's what the government does. It takes over and it starts paying people to spread the word. Will that word be changed by Constantine's influence? You decide, because you can just see what happened at Nicaea. I showed you the 12 passages about what Jesus says, the Father is the only true God. How did that go away? Because there's tons of money that it was a payoff. Like most of them were getting. 5 people were brave to say, no, I'm not going to go along with that. So now let's listen to this. Page 22, Tolstoy, Church and State. Oh, you wish to call yourself a Christian and continue to be the chief of the cutthroats, to assault, burn, fight, do mischief, execute, and revel. All right. And they, that is the well-paid clergy funded by Constantine, furnished him a Christianity and made it very comfortable, better than could have been expected. They anticipated that he might, on reading the gospel, bethink himself that there was more demanded of him than the building of churches and the visiting of them, that a Christian life is there required. And they thoughtfully and with foresight constructed such a Christianity for him that he could, without embarrassment, live in the old heathen way. So they let him be what he wanted to be. What? Hey, he had greased all their palms. No matter what, they were never going to confront him. Never. Okay, now this next quote is, I'm going to explain it after I quote it, but it's basically, what if the gospel that was going to be given to Constantine would be an easy peasy gospel, just to say some stuff and you're going to be okay. So this is what it says. Talking about the Nicene Church told Constantine the following: Christ, the Son of God, appeared for no other purpose than to redeem you, Constantine, and all the others. Because Christ died, Constantine can live as he pleases. So you just have to believe that he's death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's all this is. Page 22 of Church and State. By the way, Tolstoy is alluding here, this idea that you just have to believe Jesus died, is alluding to Paul's unconditional promise in 1 Corinthians 15, 1-4, that if you believe Christ died and resurrected, you shall be saved. See? So he's mocking this principle by saying this is all Constantine was told he had to do, and so he could live as he pleased. Okay, now I'm going to read from page 22. I want to preface this by saying Tolstoy, when he was a young man, was a member of the Russian Orthodox Church. But then he became basically, you almost could say like a Protestant, but he's free of the Catholicism and the Orthodox Church, and he was just following Christ. That was his doctrine, the words of Jesus only. And if this is not enough, one may repent and swallow a piece of bread. He's talking about what they would tell Constantine what you have to do. Just swallow this piece of bread with some wine, and this there will be salvation. All will be forgiven. And not satisfied with this, they even consecrated Constantine's ruffianly, that word means brutal, power, and said that he was from God and anointed him with oil. So they treated him as if he was like a king of God, meaning appointed by God. You anoint only kings that God has selected with oil. That would be biblical. But that's not who he was. He was not a Christian at all. He was a phony. And how can I say that for sure? Because he put up a statue of himself right after Nicaea, a big pole statue, and way on top, guess whose face was Apollo? So it had all the imagery of Apollo along the entire column, and guess whose face was in they had to put a statuary image of someone in the top. Who do you think it was? It was Constantine. The guy was believing that he was God, Apollo, and that's what it turned out. And he imported the Delphic oracles, Delphic cistern where she would sit in the ground. It was about 6 feet down. It's still there to this day in Constantinople. The city has been renamed, but that city still has the Delphic oracle cistern where she would sit there on some hot coals, and she had a tripod sit there, and she would issue glossalia nobody could understand, and the priest would interpret it, and that would be the prophecies that she would make. So he brought that in, and so oops, but did you know that the Delphic oracle served the god Dionysus technically, but actually they believe Dionysus is also known as Apollo. So this made a perfect match for Constantine, who thought he was Apollo, meaning god of the sun in the Greek vernacular. And that's what he was doing by taking the Delphic oracle material and that cistern she would sit in, deep 6-foot cistern, downward, and he was making that so that he could have her prophecies right there out in front of him, in front of his courtyard. So the top column was there, and then the cistern, and it's still there to this day. The cistern is, I'm not sure, but the Muslims took down all statuary because they believe that's wrong. And I don't know what happened to the face of Constantine, but it was a fact of history that was what this is the image in the column in Constantinople. So was he Christian? No. Was he ever a Christian? No. You can't do these things. And then the brutality of what he did to try to make people believe there's more than one God. I mean, it's just obvious he wasn't a Christian. All right, so we've completed this first half of The Church and State by Tolstoy. I'm going to do a ebook on this particular episode, as I'm going to try to do for every episode hereafter. And for $5, you can get all the original notes and slides and some additional slides that I decided not to use, but they're still relevant and still useful. And I'll provide you also the book of Church and State in public domain, and so that will be separately downloadable from my ebook. But anyway, here's the interesting thing is the Romans 13 issue of Church and State is very much alive because I remember this, and a lot of other people still do too. In the late 2010s to the early 2020s, there was a movement among police officers that became significant, and it had a huge following among police officers that they were Romans 13 cops. And this is how it was synopsized here. Police officers identifying as Romans 13 refers to a controversial interpretation of the Bible verses Romans 13, 1-7, which says government authorities are God's servants and the citizens must obey them. In law enforcement, this is sometimes used to justify unquestioning public obedience and to assert that officers act as divine agents of justice. While it has been a popular concept in Christian police chaplaincies for years, it gained significant public attention and sparked debates around the late 2010s to early 2020s The debate centered on whether this ideology gives officers a moral path to use excessive force or demand compliance. So I remember watching interviews of officers defending this and so on in this time period. And it was very troubling because this is the fusion of church and state, where you believe you are literally God's agent and you can execute justice because you are God's agent. You can kill on the street if you need to without impunity, without regard to what the law of the country or the state you live in. As a police officer, you must follow that law, not a, quote, higher law that Paul justifies as your sense of what you think is right and wrong, and you're going to enforce justice right on the spot. Can't do that. You got to follow the law. You've been hired to serve those people, that state you serve, or the police agency you serve. So anyway, this is a real thing, and like I said, this is an issue. Church and state is still a problem today. We see it all the time now. So if you're interested in purchasing the ebook version of this episode, you would find it in the description to the video. You log in there and you'll see a link that you can then be sent to this page, which, for example, this is part 1 of the episode I did on the Great Divide, Paul and Jesus, part 1, Jesus on the Duration of the Law. So you'll help my ministry by continuing to support me by buying things that are useful to you anyway. And I'll hope you do. And God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.